everybody. I'm Joanna Crow. I'm a professor of Latin American Studies at Bristol. I'm a historian, and for the last few years I've been investigating how ideas about race travelled across borders in early 20th century Latin America, and how these cross-border conversations impacted on nation-state policies in the region. I'm currently working on a book project about 4 international congresses that took place between the 1920s and the 1950s. The first Latin American Communist Conference in Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1929, the 27th International Congress of Americanists in Lima in 1939, the first Inter-American Conference of Social Security in Santiago in Chile in 1942, and the third Inter-American Indigenista Congress, which took place in La Paz in Bolivia in 1954. So I found loads of different source materials on these congresses, the published proceedings, newspaper reports, personal and institutional correspondence, and in a couple of cases, personal testimonies or memoirs of people who've been there. Now, these were very different kinds of congresses, very different kinds of international meetings. The first, for example, was a semi-clandestine event that brought together about 40 communist delegates. It took place in the not very well-known premises of one of the committees of the Argentine Communist Party in a very working-class area in Buenos Aires. The second, in Lima, was a much more grandiose affair with about 300 delegates, mainly archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, gathering in venues like the Presidential Palace or the National Senate. So very different kinds of congresses, different attendees, formats, focuses, exposures, but they all dedicated a significant amount of time to debating the problem of racial inequality, and especially the ongoing marginalization of indigenous peoples in the region. So I'm interested in who was at these congresses, who was speaking to who, what conversations they were having. I'm also interested in the spaces where the conversations took place. So the venues that were chosen for the kind of inaugural and the plenary sessions, also where the smaller panel sessions took place. What did the rooms look like? What did the setup look like? And what about the spaces outside the formal discussion sessions? So the drinks receptions, the visits to archaeological sites and museums, the dance and music and theatre shows, the restaurants where delegates ate, the hotels where delegates stayed. And I'm interested in this because I've spent many years attending international academic conferences, and in some ways I don't think my own experience is that different to how delegates lived these conferences 100 years ago. So what I tend to remember and value most of a conference, or what I sometimes remember and value most of a conference, is not so much the detail, of the academic papers that I've listened to, but the conversations that happen in the coffee breaks, or that happen in dinner, at the end of the day, over dinner at the end of the day. And I think this is where we often form connections and kind of initiate some of these long-lasting collaborations that we have. That was quite a long preamble to get to my JGI project. So I've been able to work with 2 brilliant researchers, Emma Hazelwood, a PhD student in JGI, and Roy Udale. Emma helped me to explore the uses of digital mapping for visualizing the kind of who and where of these congresses, and Roy helped me to experiment a little bit with machine reading. And I've just got a few things that I want to share, a few of the things we've done and a few of the things that I've learned. So Emma started by inputting the data I had on the people who'd attended these congresses, their names, their nationalities, and where they travelled from, into Excel spreadsheets. She then found coordinates of the cities or countries using an online resource and displayed them on a map using a coding language called Python. So these are a couple of the results from Lima, but they don't show up so well because of the lighting. The global map in the middle shows very clearly that this was a forum bringing together delegates from North, Central, and South America, and also several countries in Europe. We can zoom in a little bit to look more closely at the regional spread of delegates, and we can zoom in further still to see what parts of Peru the Peruvian delegates were coming from. We can also visualize the proportion of men and women attending this Congress. It was mainly men. For those delegates that were based in Lima, because we have their addresses, we can map precisely what parts of Lima they or their institutions were based in. Now, in some ways, these visualizations don't tell me very much that I didn't already know. From the list of delegates that I compiled, I already had a sense of the spread of countries represented in Lima in 1939. However, I think what the maps do is tell the story of the international nature of the conference much more clearly or quickly than a list or a table can. In the case of the city map, on the right, showing where Lima-based delegates lived and worked, I think this does reveal something new, because by plotting the addresses, I can envisage or start to envisage a space that they occupied and their circuits. And I couldn't do that in my head with just the list of addresses, especially if you don't know the city so well. Here we have the global locations of the delegates, or the global origins of the delegates for each of the 4 congresses. By putting the maps together, we get a clear view of the really quite similar international reach of these congresses. So most of the delegates, to all of them, came from South America. It also allows us to rapidly spot the differences between the congresses. So the fact, for example, that the Lima conference attracted more delegates from Europe than other meetings, the fact that Canada was only represented at the 1942 Congress in Santiago, the fact that there were no delegates from Europe at the 1954 Congress in La Paz. Emma also created these waffle charts. They visualize the same information as the maps, but differently, with delegates' sub-regional origins represented in a kind of sharper numerical way, with a block for each delegate, and also through colour. And this, again, it brings to the fore a few things that I hadn't initially noticed with the maps, perhaps because of the way the lines cover each other up in the map. So, for example, I hadn't noticed that so obviously that Central America had a far greater representation at the Communist Party's conference in Buenos Aires than at the other meetings. So seeing this prompts us to investigate why, and dig in further. The last map shows us the main venues for the Lima, I've gone back to Lima, shows us the main venues for the Lima Congress in 1939. And as with the map of the Lima-based delegates' homes and institutions, this map helps to visualize a circuit for us, the spaces that delegates would have been inhabiting during the time of the Congress. I don't think that we can perceive this so clearly from a list, again, especially if we're not very familiar with the city. And here we can see that most of the conference venues and the hotels where delegates were staying were clustered quite closely together in the historic centre of the city. Delegates could easily walk between them, but there are a few outliers. The archaeological sites that the delegates visited, the anthropology museum in the bottom left that threw a big reception for the delegates, and a couple of the restaurants too. So again, I think this prompts further questions and encourages us to imagine the delegates moving around these city spaces. Now, this is my last slide. Now, machine or distant reading is perhaps the tool or methodology that I'm most interested in, and that I'm only just beginning to explore, and I've just left myself a minute or two to talk about it, and that's partly because I'm still very much trying to work out how it's helpful to me and what it adds to my analysis of the historical documentation, without it. So I'll just flag a couple of things here. So we know that in the context of the Second World War, many academic and government organizations around the world rejected the scientific validity of the term race, or in Spanish, the term raza. A machine reading of the proceedings of these 4 congresses gives us concrete empirical evidence of how the word race was in practice used less and less from 1929 through to 1939, 1942 and 1954. Text analysis software like Sketch Engine, which is what Roy introduced me to, allows us to scrutinize how the term race was used when it was used. So, for example, in the case of the 1929 conference in Buenos Aires, Sketch Engine processes 300 or 400 pages of conference discussions super speedily and shows us in a systematic way which so-called races were being talked about, the way that race was spoken of as an object and as a subject in relation to the verb, and how delegates associated race with hostile relations or desconfianza, with nationhood, sometimes specifically with indigenous communities, reducciones, exploitation, and cultural tradition. So I think it is a really useful kind of methodical snapshot of the many different languages of race that were being spoken at these congresses, or at this at the 1929 Congress. So it's then up to me, to reflect on the significance of the detail and to go back to specific moments in the text. So, for example, the statement of one delegate talking about converting the race factor into a revolutionary factor. So I'll wrap up. With this JGI Seedcorn project, I've learned how digital tools and methodologies can productively change how we're able to look at things or how we're able to see things. In this case, race talk, and who's speaking. So what do I want to do from here? What I'd really like to do is to trace where the conversations went from these congresses. And this will involve mapping newspaper publications, organisation reports, letters that make references to these congresses. Who was writing where, who was publishing where. And it will also involve a distant quantitative reading of the circulation of ideas to both inform and supplement my own closer, more qualitative reading. So that's where I see this going, hopefully. Thank you.